So what you didn't say is that I'm actually from Bournemouth.
Yes.
I was born in Boscombe Hospital, which has now been knocked down, I believe, very sadly. And I must admit that when I left Bournemouth, I never thought that Labour would get 34 or 35% in a general election, which you guys did in Bournemouth East and West, so well done. I believe in 1997, which obviously we're told, you know, this is the golden era for Labour. It was, to be fair, the highest share of the vote Labour had got in England for a very long time. They got 20% in Bournemouth. So to get in the mid-30s is a real accomplishment, and it tells you there's something much bigger going on here. It's not just about the appeal of Jeremy Corbyn. It's not just about the fact that we're in a very profound economic crisis, as dull as it can often seem, with declining wages playing out over the course of years rather than months. It's about a broader shift in social consciousness. It's about a broader shift in the demographics of places like Bournemouth. So what do I mean? The place that I grew up in, the place which I couldn't wait to get out of, you know, I went to university in London because I wanted to be somewhere cosmopolitan, multicultural, diverse, exciting, where you could really be ambitious and do things. And I wanted to go to London, right? And that's not to denigrate Bournemouth. The way our country works is that there's a huge bias towards the metropole, towards London. If you want to do anything, that was what you were told. Go to the big cities, London or Manchester. And I think what's happened in recent years is places like Bournemouth, you've had these hugely growing universities. So they're attracting many talented young people. You've had a shift in terms of their racial composition. They're becoming far more diverse. And something is just changing. And it makes me think of a line I was told by a good friend, James Medway, who's an advisor to John McDonnell. And he said, we think of France as being a radical country, but it has radical institutions and conservative people. Whereas Britain has conservative institutions, but radical people. And I'm inclined to agree with that. Yes, we have the monarchy. Yes, we have this weird electoral system. Yes, Westminster looks ridiculous. But there's something, I think, in terms of the broader social psychology of Britain, which it lends itself to radicalism. I've always thought that. And you'd sort of, you know, I think of Bournemouth as a bastion of working class conservatism, southern conservatism. But you'd still see people say, oh, you know, I'm a citizen of everywhere, or, you know, I'm a citizen of the world, or, what's work all about? There was something in a kind of common sense, everyday common sense, which was certainly at odds with capitalist realism. I'll talk about what that is in a second. What I think Jeremy Corbyn, combining with these changing demographics, combined with the fact more young people are in the town going to university here, what it means is that there's now an opportunity for what were previously privately held beliefs to become public. So many of you in this room probably entertained thoughts 3-4 years ago, and you thought, well, I'm in a minority. You know, I think we could run the economy better in a different way. I think we could have more social housing. We could scrap fees. But you thought you were in a minority. There weren't many people that agreed with you. And what the Corbyn moment has allowed, if nothing else, is for many of us to come into public spaces and to find one another. And that in itself is incredibly powerful. And even if the Corbyn project fails, which I don't think it will, that will create the foundation for something else. And what happens to failure is very important, because most political movements fail. Well, how they fail is key. I came out of the 2010 student movement against increasing tuition fees. That was the thing that I was already a social democrat. I got very radicalised by it. I lost a lot of confidence in the parliamentary system, in Westminster. You know, that combined with Iraq, you really think you can't trust mainstream politics. And we lost. Fees went up by 300%. But the people radicalised by that process are now doing a range of things. James Schneider was radicalised by that process. He now works for Jeremy Corbyn, as do a dozen people I know that work in and around the Labour leadership. The person who was the campaign manager for Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez in New York is a guy called Max Kremer. He was in Edinburgh during the student fees revolt. He was radicalised by it. He's now helped manage the campaign for a woman who's about to transform the Democratic Party in the United States. So that defeat set the political tone, I think, for the next 10 to 20 years. So don't be too pessimistic about what the word defeat can mean. I always like the anecdote of 1848 revolutionaries. There were German revolutionaries. They left Germany after 1848. Defeated revolution. Where do they go? A lot of them went to the United States, and a lot of them actually advanced the cause of abolitionism to get rid of the slave trade and to get rid of slavery in the US. And at the Battle of Gettysburg, several of the key Union generals were German revolutionaries from 1848. Amazing. Karl Marx would regularly celebrate Abraham Lincoln. There are, in fact, letters between the two men. There's a book on this by a guy called Robin Blackburn, very good book. And so that, again, lends itself to a question. What is defeat? Were those revolutionaries defeated? I would submit they weren't. Right? They were leading the Union forces at Gettysburg to defeat white supremacist forces of the Confederacy. So we shouldn't be worried about defeat. I don't think Corbyn will be defeated, but it's something to keep in mind for the microcosms, the occasional setbacks, which are inevitable in politics. So why does Bournemouth matter? Bournemouth matters because we can't win a general election unless we win a lot of these seats on the south coast. And I'm not just saying this to get riled up. It's all about Bournemouth. It is, even though it's 80, 81 on the target seats, I believe. In a certain sense, it's a lot higher than that, because trying to radicalise the south coast is key to Labour forming a majority in Parliament. We all know about Hastings. We all know about, obviously, Canterbury. You go further, towards Kent. In Cornwall, some of the numbers for Labour in terms of increases the last election were phenomenal. So between the south coast and between Scotland, you can sort of begin to see how Labour form a parliamentary majority. So what you guys are doing here is really, really, really profoundly important, and it's of national significance. And when you're in Bournemouth, and I'm from Bournemouth, so I know exactly how it feels, you think all the action's in London. But because we have the pleasure of living in a parliamentary democracy, you guys send back as many MPs as 70,000 people living in Lewisham, or in Hackney, or in Islington. So you need to make sure that you return an excellent young woman here, and another person as well from Bournemouth, and really send a message to Tories in the south coast that this isn't their backyard anymore. I think you've got how many? 50 Tory councillors in your local council?
Yeah.
49. This is good. 51. This is good, because this is actually a positive thing. It's good there are no Labour councillors at the moment. Right? It's a good thing. The reason why is that you compose as the party of the anti-establishment. Right? Very difficult to do in somewhere like Sunderland or Middlesbrough, where Labour councils have been running the city for forever. Or in London, in Southwark, where you've got Labour councils overseeing regeneration, gentrification, or in Haringey. You guys don't have that problem. You can really run an insurgent, bottom-up, grassroots campaign about transforming the town, about transforming the UK. So how do we win? We win by building coalitions. And I want you to think about the core coalition that a Labour government's going to be based on. Okay? Firstly, it's clearly going to be the older industrial working class. Less of a thing here because Bournemouth, Dorset, I think, is the only county in the country without a city. Never industrialised, therefore never had an organised industrial working class, therefore doesn't have that legacy of trade unionism. Normal. Same further west, of course. So that's more of a variable up north. What are the variables here? It's the youth. People who are not just young kids or students, but I would say really anybody under 30 who is university educated who is here. Because they have an ideological realisation, I think, they've had an ideological realisation over the course of the last several years that they aren't going to get what they've been promised. And at first you won't get angry about that, because that might take a year or two to kick in. But when you realise that you're never going to own a home, when you realise that pay is stagnated for a decade, real wages for people in their 20s measured on an hourly basis is lower now than it was in 2009, okay, on an hourly basis. TUC research from 2015 showed that wages were 10% lower, real wages were 10% lower, that's indexed for inflation, in 2015 than they were in 2008. This has never happened before. So when a generation of people, and that began to happen last June, realise that their future has been taken away from them, they will get very angry. And what is key for you, as much as sending left-wing MPs to Westminster, is providing them with everyday answers, in so much as you are disappointed, not because of migration, not because of brown and black people, not because we moved away from some nostalgic idea of what Britain was 50, 60 years ago, but because a set of elite interests rigged the economy in their favour, knowing that people like you would suffer. And you need to put that in their heads. Because if you don't, the forces of the far right will. And it's not to exaggerate things. We love to exaggerate on the left. It's not to exaggerate things. That is precisely the binary which is now happening. And I think a neat way of looking at it is like this. In 1998, when France won the World Cup, the liberal intelligentsia of France said, look, we're a multicultural country. France is finally comfortable with itself. We've got black players, we've got mixed race players, brown players, white players. Great, we've arrived. 4 years later, Jean-Marie Le Pen gets into the runoff for the final two for the presidency. 7 years later, you have month-long riots in the banlieues of Paris, striated heavily along racial lines as well as class lines. So that was a lie. But because the sort of political common sense of the time was that, it made sense for them. They believed that, by the way, when they say it. Intuitively, it made sense for them. Okay, look, this represents this lie we like to tell ourselves about concord between the classes, between the races of France. Great, aren't we wonderful? That same lie couldn't be repeated if England won the World Cup. That tells you what's changed in the last 10 years in particular. So either a World Cup victory would be seen as, an emboldened Brexit Britain. Look, we're great again. We don't need anybody else. That could happen. Or it may be, wow, we can really celebrate this team, but look at the distance between them and everyday Britain. This is a bunch of working class people. They're there on merit. They're from across the country. You've got 3 Yorkshiremen at the back. You've got Mancunians. You've got Scousers. You've got people from the northeast. You've got Londoners. And they're the best in the world. And that in no way reflects the country we have. We have a huge metropolitan bias to London. We have a austerity which hits brown and black people, particularly in major cities, the hardest. And we certainly don't have, I'm not a big fan of meritocracy. We certainly, let's at least get to base one. We certainly don't have an economy based on meritocracy. So I think, the fact that the two conclusions you could come to from an England World Cup victory, neither of which being that easy liberal argument, tell you the common sense of 20, 30 years ago has gone. So you need to go into that vacuum and you need to proselytise, almost like priests, the gospel of Corbyn, the gospel of Labour, the gospel of socialism. And that's not just about ideas, it's also about self-interest. You do need to appeal to people's self-interest. And the liberal left has made the mistake of decades of trying to channel an impulse to charity. You were going to build a mass movement wanting socialism because it's in people's self-interest. It's in their self-interest for their parents and their grandparents to have social care. It's in their self-interest for their kids to have free university education. It's in their self-interest for very generous public pensions and very generous unemployment insurance. It's in their rational self-interest. That's what we have to communicate. I want to move on to the media, and this is particularly pertinent to the local context. You've maybe seen the Evening Standard has lost £10 million this year. Anybody seen this? Yeah. A free newspaper, who would have thought it? Going bankrupt. If you look at the sort of the numbers of daily newspapers, the Daily Mirror, the Sun, they're in freefall. The Daily Mirror, you could say it's the working class paper of the left in this country. Its sales are declining 20% year on year. Many of these newspapers won't be here by the next general election. And when that happens, it's going to be a very weird psychological shift. And you can already see it. The BBC is actually playing an ever larger role in the sort of national conversation as the papers decline, which is no bad thing. But you need to think very concretely now, how do you in Bournemouth impact the media conversation here? In terms of radio, in terms of local print newspapers, in terms of blogs, what kind of media do young people consume? Something to think about. Because that won't just be about, again, electing people. Once you're in power, how do you make sure that the ideas that you guys want to reproduce become the common sense locally? Because the Bournemouth I left, it was a great success. It was a triumph to have, chain restaurants and out-of-town shopping centres. But what you need to convey to people is actually success would be, wouldn't this be wonderful? Worker-owned businesses along the seafront, and breweries, and restaurants, and cafes, and artists that owned the gallery space and the studios that they worked in, right? And designers, graphic designers and web developers coming together in worker-owned co-ops to produce stuff. That's the kind of town and kind of future you need to sell to people with, totally electric, zero carbon, ultra cheap public transport. It's not utopian. The technology is here. We need the politics. And people will continue to think it's impossible until they think it's inevitable. And that's your task. And like I say, media is going to be a very big part of that. So, I'll move on to the book and then I'll take questions. I don't want to rabbit on forever. My book, which I'm kind of finishing at the moment, called Fully Automated Luxury Communism. That may sound like a bit of a strange title. It's meant to provoke. What does it mean and why are the words in that sequence? Fully automated. We all know automation is coming, but for who? Luxury. What's the opposite of getting up at 7 a.m. and working a 60-hour week? Take a guess. Communism. Well, that's where the politics comes in, because it says there is nothing inevitable about the dividends of technological change redounding to the benefit of everyday people unless there's a politics alongside it. Okay? And I would say that's a politics of the many, not the few, taken to its rational conclusion. Now, what's the basis of fully automated luxury communism? And this is where the utopianism comes in. I say there are three, well, so far there's been two revolutions in the whole of human history. Forget the French Revolution or the US Revolution, the English Revolution. It was a revolution, it wasn't a civil war, right? First country in the world that killed a king, not because he was a bad king, but because he was a king, because he represented the concept of monarchy. They said this was in England. So don't take it from people that were a conservative country. We just had the misfortune of having our revolution happen first, which meant it went, belly up. The two revolutions which we've had so far, the first was about 12,000 years ago. We call it the Neolithic Revolution, the agricultural revolution. Now, Homo sapiens, our predecessors, people with brains just like ours, have been around for hundreds of thousands of years. But they've only been using agriculture, domesticating animals, making food, like this for 12,000 years. And I'll give you an example. Wheat is not a naturally occurring crop. It comes about as it's three different wild varieties of grass coming together, made by our ancestors 12,000 years ago. Bananas are infertile. About 9,500 years ago, it's all the same plant. Every banana you eat is from the exact same, you might think this guy's talking complete crap, what the hell? Go Google it, okay? It was an innovation. Right? And we didn't understand the idea of heredity or genetic inheritance until the 19th century, a guy called Gregor Mendel. But the whole point of the agricultural revolution is that we began to understand you can breed in and breed out certain features for crops, and you can also change the psychology of animals, again, through a process of domestication. Agriculture, okay, what the hell are you talking about agriculture? What does that make possible? It makes possible ever more complex forms of society. It makes possible cities, writing, culture, irrigation. We begin to get the great civilizations after the Neolithic Revolution. So that's a real revolution, right? There's no going back, okay? And all of a sudden, you have ever larger groups of people can create a surplus. And so off the basis of that surplus, you have this new thing called society. Second revolution, 250 years ago, Industrial Revolution, okay? And you can talk about, say, Renaissance Italy, 16th century, Machiavelli, Dante, all in Florence. Sounds very, advanced, very sophisticated, but the quality of their drinking water was no different to first century Rome. They didn't have indoor heating. They were still getting their light from flames. Really no progress, measurably. And that will then changes with the Industrial Revolution, because what you see there is a move to post-scarcity with motive power, as we understand that a steam engine can combust hydrocarbons, initially coal, and that this can replace the labour of animals, of humans, of watermills, of windmills. This is the second revolution. And this then gives you a globalised economy. It gives you the factory system. It gives you capitalism. It gives you mass production. It gives you consumer society. Transforms the world incredibly quickly. It takes you 3 weeks to get from Philadelphia to New York at the beginning of the 19th century. With the arrival of the railroad, it takes 72 hours. Clearly that transforms the way you understand the world. So that's the second revolution. We are in the first opening decades of the third. How wonderful. And it's about a transition to post-scarcity and cognitive labour, which effectively means that anything which is repetitive will ultimately be automated, which obviously poses immense difficulties for a society based upon jobs. If you look at agriculture, until as recently as the 17th, 18th century, 70% of some European countries worked in agriculture. We had to do that to feed people. And if you said, well, one day we'll have societies where 1, 2, 3% of the labour market work in agriculture, they would have said, that's ridiculous. That's absurd. It's utopian, which is precisely the world we have today. In the US, less than 1% of the labour market works in agriculture. It's the world's biggest producer of corn, poultry and beef. In this country, I think it's about 2%. And I would submit the exact same thing is going to happen to all the jobs we have today, in services and in manufacturing. Ultimately, I think by the end of the 21st century, you're going to get down to about maybe 3 or 4% of the jobs we presently have can't be automated because there's a level of innovation every day. You have to be creative. I said this to Jeremy Vine on the Jeremy Vine show. You come in every hour, you're doing something different every day, something different. Yeah, that might take time to automate. But most jobs are repetitive, from cardiac surgery to radiology to driving to warehousing to a cashier. It's very repetitive. We know that we've done these jobs, so they can be automated. And this poses significant problems for capitalism because not only does it mean you can't get jobs, but the capitalists then lose consumers with the means of buying the things they're producing ever more efficiently, which creates a problem of oversupply. There's a great anecdote between Henry Ford's grandson, Henry Ford III, and a guy called Walter Reuter. He was a trade unionist in the US in the 1950s. Henry Ford has got this brand new, most advanced automotive factory in the world. And he takes Walter Reuter around and he said, how do you think these robots are going to pay union dues? And then Walter Reuter turns straight back and says, how do you think they're going to buy your cars? Right? That's the key question if we are moving to ever higher levels of automation. And even if we're conservative about this, okay, let's say globally, technological change means that unemployment rises to 30% this century, 30%. That's the same level as Greece today. It doesn't seem particularly, stable politically. So even quite conservative changes in terms of what this does to our labour market is interesting. And I would assume actually poses a secular challenge to capitalism. And part of the challenge with the Corbyn project is we're talking about break with neoliberalism, we're talking about very vague social democratic demands, not vague rather, precise social democratic demands, but that needs to be folded within a broader critique of the kind of society we have and the opportunities within it. And it's not just limited to automation. If you look at something called, who here has heard of synthetic meat? Mm-hmm. Synthetic meat, yeah? Cellular agriculture, the idea that you could grow, it's meat without the animals. Mark Post in 2008, he's a Dutch professor, you can go check this out again, you can Google it. He grows a hamburger for $350,000, right? It's a bit rubbery, it's got no fat, that's the problem, right? The composition is just lean meat, it's not very tasty, but it's meat. $350,000. Today, the same hamburger can be produced for around, they reckon, $25. And ultimately, with synthetic meat, of course, it's going to become a huge product once it's got price parity with regular meat. So what does synthetic meat mean? What does it do? It uses around 90% less water, around 95% less land, clearly far less labour. The CO2 emissions compared to livestock, negligible. So all of a sudden, we have a crisis of, well, just the 7.5 billion of us right now are using far more of the world's biocapacity than it actually has. We're living beyond our means, right? We're in our sort of ecological overdraft, primarily actually because of our meat consumption and our dietary habits, more even than transport. All of a sudden, that's not an issue because you've got synthetic meat. And so what looks like a secular crisis is really just overcome. And another great vignette about this, of how quickly things can change and how you get, I call them disruptions, not revolutions, these 3 revolutions. I call them disruptions because I want to appeal to like Silicon Valley idiots. Okay? I believe they're revolutions, but let's call them disruptions. There's a crisis in London in 1894. It's called the horse manure crisis. The London horse manure crisis. And the Times of London says, in 30 years' time, the whole of the city is going to be under 6 feet of horse manure. Because it's the largest city in the world, it's got the highest population, and it's been subject to all of these tendencies made possible by the second revolution, right? Infant mortality falls, longer life expectancy, you can have a very complex city with, lots of difficulties in terms of the built environment are being surmounted. We understand hygiene now, we understand a bunch of things. But there's this big problem, we're still using horses to get around. And that means, like I say, the whole of the city is covered in horse manure. The world's first ever urban studies conference was in New York in 1900, I think. It was to look at the problem of horse manure in cities. It was like the challenge of the late 19th century, because you had tens of thousands of horses crapping everywhere, right? So how was that overcome? Because what you had was a technology of the first revolution, domesticated horses, coming up against the social formations of the city, entirely an outgrowth of the second revolution. And so obviously the answer was going to be an attendant technology that comes out of the second revolution, right? automobiles, public transport, and so on. So by 1910, 1920, people are looking back and going, how the hell was this ever a problem? And if we have the appropriate politics with things like synthetic meat, that's precisely what we can do with climate change. It's the same with renewable technology. You can go on a website and you can look at real time in the national grid. You can do it right now. You can look on your phone. I'm not making this up. And you can see how much energy is coming from respective sources. So you've got solar, you've got wind, you've got gas, you've got geothermal, biomass, yada, yada, yada. It's all there. And today, solar's probably been responsible for about the same amount of electricity as, certainly more than nuclear, probably about the same as gas. It would be on level pegging on a day like this, which is unreal to believe in Britain, but it's true. And we could transition to completely clean energy incredibly quickly if there was the political will. People say, well, Britain, you know, it's not sunny enough. But it's a very green country, right? Trees and grass are solar-powered chemical reactions. It's called photosynthesis, okay? There's plenty of sun. There's enough sun and wind in this country for us to transition completely to renewable energies. The point is, there isn't the political will. So when we talk about Corbyn, when we talk about Labour, I want you to always think about that bigger picture. The technologies at our feet, whether it's automation, whether it's renewable technology, whether it's things like gene editing. I mean, this is crazy. This is another one, and I'll finish on this. It's as exciting as the stuff about synthetic meat. Gene editing, and it's not eugenics before anybody gets worried, right? There are thousands of conditions which are formed by a single incorrect letter in your DNA. Huntington's, sickle cell anemia, a single letter. Now, when we think about DNA, think of it like digital information. Digital information is zeros and ones. Your DNA is, who's a biologist here? No? No doctors? No? Your DNA, there are 4 nucleotides in your DNA. This is like, imagine it's 0, 1, 2, 3. And you, and you, and you, and you, and me, we are combinations of this very complex form of information, far more complex than digital information. And just one of those letters being wrong can give you sickle cell anemia or Huntington's. And we now have a technology that's called CRISPR-Cas9, which can effectively do a cut, copy, and paste with DNA. And they think that the easiest application of this would be to withdraw some stem cells from your body, edit that DNA, and then put it back in your body. And at the very least, that would mitigate these conditions, if not get rid of them. And of course, when people are in earlier years, it's going to be more effective, or maybe even in utero, right? Another one. Gene editing and CRISPR comes out of the fact that biology is becoming an information good. So in 2003, the human genome was mapped. The entire human genome was mapped for the first time. It cost billions of dollars, right? It took 13 years to map the whole human genome. Today, that same process, right, costs $1,000, and it can be done in under an hour, the entire genome. And a whole bunch of very clever people think that it could probably, because it's falling on the same price-performance, actually quicker, price-performance ratio as computing technologies, it could be 30, 50 pence in 10 to 15 years. So what would that mean? We can map a whole genome. So what? A couple of really interesting things, actually. So a tumour has its own genome. Isn't that crazy? A tumour in your body has its own genome. So you would be able to have every week, let's say, a blood test, and it's looking for the genome of a potential tumour. And this is being discussed openly by specialists in cancer research. We will be able to detect cancer in stage 0 before it even exists. Okay? And because the thing is so cheap, you would be able to have these tests incredibly regularly. It could be automated. It might be, you might be able to integrate that technology within a wearable, like an Apple Watch or something. Of course, we'd nationalise these companies by then, right? Too important to leave it to these people. Similarly, a child, right now, cultures across the world, when a child's born, we do all these little rituals. A child, the second it is born, you test its genome, and immediately you can scan for every single condition that could lead to early years infant mortality, straight away. And it would take that figure even lower. And the moment it's born, you'd be able to say, well, there's a disposition to X, Y, Z, I know it's quite kind of scary as well. So this person's very likely to get Parkinson's perhaps at 50. We could do this treatment like this. We can edit X, Y, Z. And this is preventative healthcare. So it's moving from responsive to preventative healthcare. All because biology, like with food and synthetic meat, is becoming an information good. Okay? When people talk about that, it sounds like airy-fairy. People think information good, they think Facebook, they think, I'm talking about very concrete things like healthcare. And in terms of why this is already here, I'll finish on this. This is a great story. A guy called David Ishii in 2017. He's a Dalmatian breeder, right? And he's also a biohacker. And he contacts the US FDA and he says, I want to edit the genome of my Dalmatians because they have this condition which gives them all gout, apparently. I've never had a Dalmatian. And if I just edit this one letter, they won't have gout. And so he writes, early 2017, this is in Wired magazine, to the FDA. Doesn't get a response. Doesn't get a response. A month later, the FDA put out a statement. We will be treating edited genes like patented pharmaceutical drugs. Of course they will. Of course they will. Would you want to be able to edit your DNA or my DNA, which means that for every single inheritor of that DNA, thousands of conditions are wiped out? No, you wouldn't. Pharmaceutical and private healthcare industry would be hit like nothing else. So all of these changes on the horizon, but unless we have a politics that meets those opportunities, it means nothing. Because in 2000, we had the exact same thing with file sharing, with the exact same thing. We had the exact same arguments. We said, this is an information good, this digital file, this MP3, and its cost of infinite replication is 0, which is to say everybody can have that MP3 file, everybody. Because you have it, it's called, you get rid of the idea of excludability. You having it and me having it isn't a problem, and you having it and you having it, and extending it constantly doesn't in any way undermine the original use of the first person, right? Until then, if either I have this or you have it, it's like replicating it, right? And this is now moving into ever more parts of the economy. And the counter-argument from capital is, well, look, if we allow people to edit genes for free, then where's the incentive for people to invest in research and development to innovate further for gene editing, So of course this needs to stay in private hands. Of course there needs to be a profit model. Otherwise they won't generate the funds to undertake their own research. And there's a sentence by an economist, by a guy called Larry Summers, who actually came up with the idea of secular stagnation, which is to say long-term growth is really knackered. In 2000 he wrote a paper, Larry Summers, and he said the fundamental, and they're looking at Napster and file sharing platforms, and they say the fundamental underpinning foundation of capitalism is you produce things for profit. And if that disappears, then rational actors won't produce things anymore. So if that does happen, we have to create monopoly, and we have to create false scarcity, right? Full scarcity. And that will apply increasingly to things like health, to food, to energy. Where there is abundance, capitalism will have to ration it, because there is too much. In fact, there's so much, it transcends the price mechanism. And I'll finish with a metaphor, because that can sound very complex, right? Who here's seen Elysium? Matt Damon. Yeah? Yeah? Seen Elysium? It's a good film, right? And there's Elysium. It's this kind of colony, this off-world colony. And they have these, these 3D printers. They can heal people. They can eliminate disease. They can replace limbs. They can even stop aging, right? And the point is, the only people that can use these are the Elysians, not people on Earth, because they're not citizens of Elysium. So it's about rights of access to technology, right? And increasingly, this is the world we are going to resemble. And if you think I'm joking, I'll finish with this. SpaceX used a Falcon Heavy rocket, a Falcon 9 rocket. You know the story, SpaceX, they send these boosters up, they land themselves. Now this is September of 2015. The same month that happened, Alan Kurdi, a 3-year-old child born in Rojava, washed up on a Turkish beach, dead, with his family trying to reach Europe. So we already have a civilization where we're using reusable rockets to come back to Earth after sending out satellites into space, and alongside that are infants being washed up on the shores of Europe. That's already happening. We don't need to watch Elysium to think about the issues of politics and rights of access to ever more advanced technologies. That's not just, of course, between the global north and the global south, but within countries as well, especially if they want to privatise their NHS. So, the powers of the human intellect are infinite. Everybody deserves the best possible life available to them. Ultimately, that's going to mean that all of us argue for and win and create the consent for a very radical socialist project. If we don't, the choice is socialism or barbarism. Thank you. Questions? you're the boss, or who's the boss? You're the boss.
That's me. I'm the big chief. Yeah.
But, I was just wondering if you can get started with my voice a bit. That's probably England, I imagine. Can you give some of us a bit of hope? Because you obviously work with the leadership to some extent. I mean, a lot of our experiences since rejoining the Labour Party is that it's still a bureaucratic monster. I mean, when Corbyn got elected, we were all excited, and yet it's just been a terrible experience a lot of the time. And you're talking about these revolutions, and we can't even get like PR.
You bring back to earth.
Manifesto, for example. It just things. I mean, I assume PR would be good for the Labour Party. We don't debate it. If ever it got into a manifesto, it's probably not going to be the next one. But our experience in the Labour Party, everything is so slow. You look at Parliament, it's embarrassing. And, you know, I'm not excited enough at the moment to think that the Labour Party is also going to have this revolution. And those ideas you're talking about are not going to make it into a manifesto. And how do you generate that excitement? I mean, is there something going on in the Labour Party at the moment where we're going to see the party change out of all existence? Because what we're talking about, that the lag is enormous.
Great question. Should we do a bunch of them?
Yeah, Sammy.
Question. This is more towards what you're writing about at the moment. You're talking about us moving from an industrial revolution to a cognitive revolution. Because of the exponential growth associated with these technologies, etc., that revolution could be upon us before people start to realise the consequences of those technologies. And talking of concrete examples, for example, as you know, we're in a position now where we could run driverless trucks. You take that to the RMT, and they're not going to be very happy.
Yeah.
How do we manage a transition so that the people that are involved in the services that become automated are left at least at the economic and social level that they are at the moment, including their families? Because I reckon if we could come up with a potential model that would fit that scenario, then you've got that model which you could roll across other industries.
Yep.
Anybody else?
I am right. You talked about selling people self-interest. Yeah, I mean, you'd think it would be easy, wouldn't you? But we're talking about people who, well, whether you agree with Brexit or not, the people who voted for Brexit are the people who are going to be hurt most by it, in large part. So that wasn't a great display of self-interest.
Very good point.
I wanted to ask a bit about a bit similar question to Steve. That there's an awful lot about power here, and how do we manage the fact that people in power might also not be too happy about all this stuff going out